Today we will step back in time to explore theories explaining what created the spark for life on Earth. Each theory has its own unique ideas and ingredients to support how life first began. In ancient Greece, the famed philosopher Aristotle was the first to theorize that all life was generated from non-living matter. No one contested this idea at the time. In fact, most people believed that maggots and flies spontaneously generated from rotting meat. This theory remained unchallenged until 1668, when Italian physician and poet F.Redi designed a controlled experiment to disprove it. His experiment consisted of leaving covered and uncovered jars containing raw meat out for a period of time. Maggots and flies only formed in the open jars. This led Redi to speculate that the maggots had hatched from eggs laid by flies and were not spontaneously generated by rotting meat, though he concluded that spontaneous generation still probably occurred in some cases. In 1745, the debate over this recipe for life continued, but the invention of the microscope changed everything. A clergyman named J.Needham concocted an experiment to reinforce Aristotle's original theory. He proposed that microscopic animals, or animalcules, formed from non-living matter if given time. In his experiment, he boiled a broth to kill any living microorganisms. After the broth had cooled, he placed it in stoppered flasks for 3 days. After this time, the broth became cloudy, and using a microscope, he observed that tiny microorganisms had spontaneously generated in it. Unsatisfied with these explanations, in 1765, Italian biologist L.Spallanzani sought to expel this theory once and for all. He altered Needham's boiling method, boiling the broth for longer. He then put the mixture in open and hermetically sealed flasks. Microbes grew in the open flasks, but not in the sealed ones. Spallanzani suggested that the microbes growing in the open flask must have come from the air. This idea would prove to be vital to help finally disprove the work of Needham and those before him. At last, in 1859, the theory of spontaneous generation was dealt its fatal blow. Renowned French scientist L.Pasteur furthered the broth experiment with open long and swan-necked flasks. Both allowed air to flow freely, but the swan-necked flask would prevent microbes in the air from contaminating the broth. He boiled broth in both types of flask and examined them a few days later. Just as he predicted, there was only microbial growth in the open long-necked flask. His theory was correct. Clay is primarily composed of a crystalline silicate molecule with water trapped in its structure. These molecules are arranged in sheet-like structures. Each crystalline layer is an exact copy of the previous one. In the 1960s, Graham Cairn Smith stated that variations in the structure of these layers gave the clays different traits. For example, a tendency to dry out quickly or being sticky in comparison to other clays. Clays are structured in a way that gives them an inherent quality and is more likely to remain in the riverbed than to be washed out to sea. When rivers dry out, the clays would dry, crack, and become dusty. These particles would be blown away by the wind. Any of the particles that reached another river would start to replicate in the layout of the original clay, like a type of inorganic natural selection. Amino acids were the organic molecules stuck to the clay through this inorganic natural selection. Smith thought that this was the basis for the proteins that formed the first cells, which eventually were able to duplicate themselves without the clay that first gave them their shape. Smith argued that any organic molecules, like amino acids in the mix with these clay structures, would be organized into polymers and copied along with the clay crystal structure. Smith called this genetic takeover and believed it was what led to the evolution of living cells. The Primordial Soup Theory addresses the origin of life in a warm body of water as a result of various chemical reactions and the complex molecules they produced as a result. It is speculated that this occurred 3.8 to 3.55 billion years ago. Around 4 billion years ago, the Earth's atmosphere was thought to have been composed of nitrogen, ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and water in the form of gas, which are the key atmospheric ingredients in this theory. An energy source thought to be lightning or meteorite impacts is considered to be the spark that allowed the breakup and fusion of these molecules to take place. The primordial soup theory was first coined by Charles Darwin, where he speculated that life began in a warm little pond with all these different chemicals present, plus light, heat, and energy. Leading on from Darwin's warm little pond idea, two scientists, A.I. O'Byrne and J.B.S. Haldane, studied and developed this model further by taking a closer look at the ingredients of the primordial soup. It was proposed that the complex organic compounds split into colloidal organic droplets called coacervates, which are a thick mix of spherical proteins wrapped in droplets of fat like mayonnaise. Coacervates were thought of as being a protocell, which is an ancestor of early cells. Enzymes in this coacervate could convert sugar to starch, causing the starch molecules to accumulate, making this protocell swell up and eventually divide into smaller coacervates, just like mitosis. These complex molecules were speculated as being amino acids, and it is thought that the bombardment of the Earth by meteorites and frequent lightning storms provided the energy needed for amino acids to form. In the 1950s, Miller-Urey recreated these conditions in the lab by recreating the Earth's ancient water cycle. By using their apparatus, they found that complex amino acids had formed in the ocean area of the experiment. Amino acids are known as the building blocks of life, as they are able to break down and also generate more complex macromolecules and polymer complexes such as proteins, which leads on to the development of metabolic networks and eventually the formation of a living cell. It is thought that hydrothermal vents may have provided the geochemical energy that was needed to create and support early life. Forming where tectonic plates are separating, magma from deep in the Earth's crust heats up the seawater that seeps down through the cracks. This hot water then rises, carrying with it dissolved minerals like copper, zinc, and iron. When the hot water comes into contact with the freezing ocean water, these metals precipitate out of the solution, forming the walls of the vent chimneys. Following the discovery of these vents in 1977, circulating theories suggest that life came from a single cell that emerged spontaneously in this high-temperature environment. The smoke-like cloud that emerges from the vents is alkaline in nature. When coming into contact with the acidic ocean water, a reaction occurs and a proton gradient is formed. This leads to chemical changes in carbon dioxide and hydroxyl ions that creates the carbon-based molecules that all living things possess. Today, hydrothermal vents can be seen bustling with life, from giant spider crabs to smaller crustaceans and fish species. Although many theories have been proposed from ancient times through to the present, many of these have since been disproved. Modern scientific theories have been considered the best recipes for life, such as the primordial soup and hydrothermal models. And one thing is certain, the perfect recipe does exist, through a certain amount of various ingredients combined in the perfect method that ultimately serves up all life on Earth.